Non-super issues. I will go through these very quickly to leave some time for questions. Financial services, I won't deal with that now, but investments in managed funds is an interesting area, and whether they can be leveraged and the interest in the fund held in a separate custodian trust. It can be done, but it can create also financial services law implications. I've listed trust law there just because the custodian is actually a trustee. So there's a body of law that regulates what they can and can't do and what positions of conflict they can and can't operate in. So stamp duty, 3 relevant junctures at which stamp duty should be considered. On the custody deed itself, because that is a separate declaration of trust, the way we establish that custody trust is that we settle it on with a $10 settled sum, so that the custody trust is sitting there ready to take a transfer of the relevant asset. As a declaration of trust over non-dutiable property, that's dutiable in Victoria at $200. The transaction itself, whereby the super fund takes a transfer of the asset into the super fund held by the custodian, that's like any other transaction. It will, if it's property, it will be assessed at ad valorem rates. And then once the property is actually held in the by the custodian, all repayments are made under the loan agreement. The asset can be, but need not be, transferred back to the super fund. And there are exceptions under the Victorian Duties Act to ensure that there's an exception from duty being assessed when that property is transferred back. It's not quite so clear in other states and territories. But for anybody in that situation, you would first make an application to the SRO to make sure that they'll apply the exception. But when you're transferring it back to the super fund. But the overarching point here is there's nothing to stop you just leaving it in the custody trust under that arrangement until the time comes to sell that asset. There's no need. The legislation refers to the right to take legal title, but it doesn't say that the fund must take legal title back. GST, provided you have a very simple bare trust deed and that there's no other reason that nothing else the custodian is doing that requires them to be registered, then there's a GST ruling referred to in the materials that says all relevant supplies, if there's simply a bare trust in place, are being made by the super fund, not by the custodian. So a supplier, say, arrangements under a lease. That means that the custodian doesn't need to obtain an ABN, it doesn't need to register for GST, and it issues tax invoices with the super fund's ABN on it as its agent. So there are our practical tips, the most important of which are raising the issues early with the bank and the lawyers. We often get calls from people saying, I've got this property settling next week and I want to settle it in my super fund. And that comes as a surprise to the lawyers and the banks and means that very rarely comes off unless you can delay settlement. Today's been about knowing the basics and the opportunities, but also importantly from a compliance perspective, the limits. So that's all from me formally, but I'm very happy to take questions along with Fiona if needs be.
Julian, we've talked about using a trust or the custodial arrangement for a property. What about in the case of listed securities? I've heard that you might need a separate trust for each security. Is that correct? Or could you do, say, a diversified portfolio within one trust?
There's probably 2 questions there. If you can use the custody trust that we've drafted is basically you settle it day one and you can continue putting new securities or properties into it under one or more different loan arrangements. So you only need one custody trust. unless the banks might require you to have a separate one for each loan. So that's the first part of it. The second part of it is, I think, comes back to this issue of replacement assets. You can put as many new assets into it into the custody trust against new borrowings, but how do you then turn over the assets and purchase new shares, so sell BHB, buy Rio, without offending the restrictions in 67, which say the buying Rio is a purchase of a new asset, but are you really using borrowed funds to make that purchase? And I actually don't know the answer to that. I think it's wrapped up in what is this concept of replacement assets, and is it acceptable for assets of equivalent value to be replaced under this custody arrangement, even though they might be securities in different companies. The only example of purchasing shares that I've done thus far relates to shares in a private company, which are obviously directors taking a long-term position in their own company. They're not going to be traded or transferred. So I actually don't know the answer to that yet. And before I set up any sort of margin lending facility in these circumstances, I'd be looking for guidance from the ATO.
As a ballpark, range of fees for selling something like this?
That would depend on who you're banking with, really. For a related party arrangement, it could actually be anything. It depends on how many compliance issues there are in the fund, what sort of asset you're purchasing, whether, if it's a related party, your lawyers are drafting the loan agreement, the charge, the custody trust, super fund. But and then if there's a bank involved, there's their fees, and all the lawyers really are doing are putting together the custody trust. So Fiona and I could probably give you some information about that afterwards.
You talk about the custodian as being a bare trust. It seems to me under the legislation, the custodian has more responsibilities than an ordinary bare trust would have, in that it has to hold the asset, for example, and not release it on request unless the debt's paid out. So how do you deal with that when you're talking about it being a bare trust all the time?
A bare trust at law is, you're absolutely right, a very bare trust. You basically hold it. It'd be like me sending someone I know to auction with my money and having them sign the contract. That's a very bare trust, and I could call for them to transfer the contract or the land to me at any time. And this is it has a little bit more in it than that. That said, I don't think that has any material consequences. It doesn't have a material consequence for GST, because the ATO has said we're not looking at a strict legal analysis of what a bare trust is. It's basically is the only reason they're in this arrangement basically to hold title under one of these limited recourse lending arrangements. So I can't. Yes, it's a little bit more than a traditional bare trust, but I can't think of any material effect that has on the arrangements.
And tax guys are telling us there may be CGT implications, depending how many hookers the trust has in the property, how many obligations it has.
Yeah, I don't think, if you think about it in broad-based terms, CGT is assessed on who owns the beneficial title. So I don't think there's any question that the super fund and its members hold the beneficial title in the property. And in fact, our custody trust expressly says, notwithstanding these arrangements, the super fund actually maintains absolute beneficial title to the asset.